Thank you, Deborah. And well, thank you all for showing up. I must say I also had to experience that drive from Red Deer this afternoon, which I've had more pleasant drives. Now you might notice that there's a bit of a change in the title. As I was editing the conference, I realized that if I were to fit everything within the time that was allotted me, I needed to shave a few years off it. And I decided to focus rather on the 19th century realities, which doesn't stop the fact that we might get into intuitions for the future. Also, you will notice as I'm talking that I don't really get a lot of sources that are deaf-generated. Well, it's a matter of it's the nature of the beast in a way. We don't have a lot. Historians rely on written documents. It's what characterizes us as a discipline, and well, there's not a lot of stuff that was generated by deaf people that we have from the period, at least for the area in which I'm concerned. Although I have a few things and I will talk about them, but most of what you'll hear about is, well, hearing people writing about the deaf. So I do realize that limitation. And the other thing is the fact that I stopped in 1900 means that I might want to ask Deborah to invite me again to talk about the period that comes after, because I do have a few intuitions, but no time to share them today. I'm first a teacher, so I will start by giving you the structure of this presentation, and then we can go on. I have 4 parts. I refrain from giving you learning objectives. So the first part will be about early attempts which happened in Quebec City. The second part will be how deaf education moves into Montreal, and well, there are dates that are associated with it. Of course, this is history. Third, institutional development after the 1850s, as the institutions or lasting institutions were created and how they developed in the second half of the 19th century. And then I want to throw a few ideas at you, actually. I have intuitions. I have intuitions which, in my doctoral thesis, well, I wrote my doctoral thesis in English just so they could be read in the United States, where much of deaf history is done. And I had the great privilege to have Dr. John Vickery Van Cleve as one of my examiners. And his remark in revising my thesis was, interesting, I wonder if the kind of intuitions that you have apply elsewhere. This is why, coming to Alberta, I'm trying to see if they possibly also apply here, or at least there are possibly differences here from the American model, which might be fruitful if we look at how it's different in Quebec. So mine is not an argument for a distinct society, okay? So first part, early attempts in Quebec City. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Canada in general, just to situate us into this bigger framework. Deaf education cannot be separated from the overall reality in which it fits. And at the time, we're talking the 1830s. Quebec, the province of Quebec today, is actually called Lower Canada, and it's a separate colony of Britain, so it functions according to a different political system, which I think we need to look at before we go into deaf education. And it also gives us an idea of the political and religious conflicts that existed at the time. I often tell my history students that they will encounter extraterrestrials with green antennae, even if they lived in the same country that they live themselves, because historical figures think differently from what we think. They have different value systems, and sometimes it surprises us. And one of the major determinants of identity in the 19th century was religion. It was very public, and it was also very conflictual, and we'll see how that impacts the deaf. Also, I might want to make a last methodological remark. My story is, once again, I don't have a lot of sources from the deaf. So my story is very much about how the deaf represent broader social trends, how they are used as examples of bigger things. And I just hope that eventually with this research and other research that accumulates, we might get a very, very good idea of the deaf at the time themselves, but so far we can't. So let's go to Quebec City, beautiful historical town on the shores of the St. Lawrence, which was the capital of Lower Canada in the 1830s. Lower Canada evolved as a result of the conquest of the British, of New France, sorry, by the British in 1760. I won't go back to that, I just want to make sure that that's the reason why there are French and English there. And when it became a British colony, the British types of institutions started being implemented there. Throughout the history of New France that had existed well before, one of the characteristics was that education was the responsibility of the church. It was not the state's role. Some politicians today would possibly like us to go back to that, but because of the expenses that are involved in that. And that was exactly the rationale. The state had no money to invest in education. So the church was primarily responsible for education, which means that it instilled mostly religious values. It was sort of its first role. Also, its role was to, as I've written there, the shorthand for reading, writing, and arithmetics, 3 R's. Education was very basic in Lower Canada in the early 19th century. It was also very exclusive. Most people got some sort of primary education, possibly a couple of years. Then they started working on the farm, and a few of them actually went up to higher studies, mostly men. Now, that means that deaf education in itself was not a big priority in Lower Canada for the beginning. Now, the state's involvement, as I mentioned, was very, very small. But in 1801, first thing you should take down, the British government implemented the Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning. Now, under that pedantic name, it was basically a system of schools which the British government wanted to implement in Lower Canada. The Royal Institution was not very successful. It did not bring concrete results, but it established the principle for the first time of a change in the relationship between the state and education. For the first time, the state became involved in educational matters, although it did not amount to much. Just for your interest, the Royal Institution for Learning still exists. It's the official name of McGill University. That government we have, and it's important to stress, is a colonial government. We have to think of Canada a bit differently from today. As you can see on the graph there, there were 2 Canadas. There was Lower Canada and Upper Canada, and Upper Canada was today's Southern Ontario. And both had the same structure. It meant that the king ultimately had all power. That was a long-standing evolution. And delegated it through the colonial office to governors who basically had the power in Upper and Lower Canada. There was a struggle for power between these governors and the people here, the Assembly. The Assembly was more or less the equivalent of today's House of Commons or the Legislative Assembly here in Edmonton. It was the members of Parliament who were elected to represent the population. As you might notice, there's no connection between them and the level above. The Assembly was, well, functioned anyway, more or less as a committee to advise the governor, to inform the governor of the will of the people, and the governor then decided whatever he wanted to do. And if he didn't want to listen to the Assembly, he could, and he did often. In the case of Lower Canada, there were conflicts with the fact that they were Catholic, but they were mostly French, and some governors wanted to implement very strict assimilation programs, which never worked. There's still enough francophones in Quebec to prove it. And they never worked essentially because there was just not the means to implement them. Now this government, I'm far away from the deaf, right? Now this government is important, understanding this is important because it is this type of government which started getting involved in education. It wanted to get involved in education so that it could implement that assimilation program to bring the French Catholics to becoming Anglo-Protestants. But did not make the investment that was necessary. And in the meantime, we have the assemblies starting to set up things, because sometimes the assembly passed a law which the governor let go, and it actually became law. In 1824, we have the first such educational law passed by the assembly, which decreed or created schools that were related to the parishes. So we don't have an assimilation program anymore. These are tied to the church again, but they're state-sponsored in some way. The idea was the state does not have the money to actually create schools, so we will let the parishes organize it on the local level, so that essentially the people who will benefit from it will pay for it through the parishes. It created a few schools, especially in the more populous, more prosperous parishes, especially in the big towns, which Quebec City and Montreal were at the time. That structure, however, was not quite satisfactory. It did not reach much of the population, and in 1829, the Assembly passed a new law which created essentially school trustees, school boards. But these school boards were based once again on the parish structure. They were local school boards. However, the Parliament was, the Assembly said that it would invest money in it to the level of basically matching grants so they would spend as much money as the parish would in education. This was furthered in 1832 by the creation of actual qualification requirements, which might interest the education students among you. Before then, anyone could teach. I did not hear a sigh of people scared here, but you know, you should. In this whole process, this assembly is also getting interested in special education. And it's within a changing social context. It's this idea of, well, education becomes important in part because towns are becoming a bit more developed, and in towns, you can't just work on the farm as your parents did. You sort of have to find a job, and often to find a job you need to read, write, and count. So education slowly becomes important, but not up until the 1830s, not enough that the state takes it over in a massive way. And there's a negotiation with the church too, because the church sees education as its traditional role and wants to influence it, because we all know that education is not innocent. We are shaping these young minds, and the church wants to shape them according to its own values, and catechism, learning the principles of the church, is really important. So in the line of special education, we have, and I'm not too sure why the Assembly got interested suddenly in special education. There's no real note of that. It's probably one member of Parliament who possibly knew people in need, which is one, and what about the deaf? And since the Assembly was not a big thing at the time, there was not a big number of members, possibly about 40, I'm not too sure how many there were. The Assembly voted to create a school for the deaf, but now, of course, the problem was, well, who will teach them? And where will it be? And in 1830, they found a man. Now, it might make you laugh. It was his name, and he's well before the Golden Arches, who was a teacher, a regular teacher, who for some reason was recruited by the Assembly, and once again, it's not too clear why, and sent to Hartford, Connecticut to study with Laurent Clerc. the methods of deaf teaching for a year. And his studies were fully paid by the Assembly. Came back in 1831 and opened a school in Quebec City. That's the house that I showed you in the introductory slide. They rented a house where school was taught. There were never a big number of students, probably 10 at the most, but the school did have a longer impact, even though it did not last for very long. MacDonald very rapidly became assisted by one of his pupils. This was, those of you who studied the history of education might know this, it was very popular in the 18th century. It's the mutual type of education. And so they would train older students to teach the lower levels while they were teaching the upper levels. So Antoine Caron, who was a deaf student of MacDonald, became one of the tutors, basically, within the school. And Antoine Caron would become important later on to the continuation of the story. In 1836, however, we would go back to our diagram about the government. All hell broke loose. Suddenly, this whole structure came apart because gradually the Assembly was demanding more and more power, and the governor was refusing to grant them power. And there were a bunch of motivations behind this, which were ethnic, religious, and political, which basically exploded in 1836. The government stopped functioning, literally. In 1836, the government was disbanded, the Assembly refused to vote the budget, and so essentially everything that depended on government subsidies, including that deaf school, closed. The year after, you might know about rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada. What had started in 1836 as this simmering tension blew up, and there was literally military rebellion in both colonies, which would bring about a constitutional change in 1840. But before we get there, we have to say that in 1836, Antoine Caron, MacDonald's assistant, MacDonald sort of went to other things. He went into journalism and he sort of vanished from the deaf scene. But Antoine Caron was recruited by the superior of a classical college. This was the equivalent of high schools at the time. They were very unique. They basically trained lawyers and priests in the future. He was asked by the superior of that college in Saint-Hyacinthe to run a special class for the deaf. And legend has it that while he was there, a certain young priest, I'll talk about him later on, Irénée Lagos, was, abandoned his parish during the rebellions, and he was sent by the Bishop of Montreal, his boss, to the College of Saint-Hyacinthe for a few months to think about what he'd done. And apparently he would have met Antoine Caron at that time and become interested in the deaf. Now, it's all apocryphal. We don't really have, we all know that both were there at the same time, but we don't quite know whether they actually communicated with one another. So that's the part of the story which is harder to verify, at least the contact. Are you following me up to here? All right? Now, what we have as outcomes of that presence of deaf education in Quebec City, which, as you can see, was quite short-lived, 1831 to 1836, 5 years, and with some kind of continuation for about 3 years, but we have no idea really what happened for those 3 years. One clear outcome is that between 1839 and 1848, there is no formal education for the deaf in Quebec. That's the easy and simple way. The other one is that state support. The one thing that was realized was that state support was not enough for special education. It was not guaranteed enough. One could not rely on it. And so, and we saw how it even right there, it was moved from the state to a church institution. Classical colleges were church institutions. So already there's a recuperation of an enterprise in education into the church. So there's a movement here that happens, which is significant later on. There is the abandonment for a long time of direct state involvement in education in Quebec. In 1840, after the rebellions and the hoopla, there was a report from a British lord who came to visit, and in 1840, essentially his recommendations were put together into the Union Act. Now, what that did was to fuse Upper and Lower Canada into one common colony and their political institutions as well. But these state structures also later evolved into a more responsible form of government. That is a government where the assembly really has power, where the assembly decides. And this is what would be enshrined later on in the Constitution that we still have in 1867. So what these new governments during the Union Act period, what the new government did was to create two separate departments of education, one for Upper and one for Lower Canada, which evolved in different ways. In Upper Canada, Egerton Ryerson moved into more of a state-controlled model. In Lower Canada, it evolved rapidly into a church-controlled model. And what the role of the state was in these circumstances was essentially to give subsidies to private institutions which would provide the education. These private institutions were generally either Catholic or Protestant church-led. And the final encounter is that apocryphal story I told you that there might be a connection between this later death and Antoine Caron after 1839. We have no idea what happened with him. So there might be a connection between him and the founder of the first lasting institution for the deaf, which was created in 1848. Are we all right so far? Now, second part, moving into Montreal, which happens around mid-century. And the whole Quebec period, in a way, is an introduction. It sets the stage for something that happens later on, which becomes permanent. And by the way, this is a lovely illustration of what Montreal was in 1852. Doesn't quite look the same today. You have a little bit more buildings there. This is an engraving which was drawn from Mount Royal, so most of what you can see here would be hidden by buildings today. But it also, one thing you can notice if you look at it, you have a lot of church spires. And they were not all Catholic. There was a lot of religious diversity in Montreal, and it was very public. So let's move education into Montreal. The Catholic Church is the first one that really gets involved into it. And the Catholic Church is a large institution, but at the same time it's made up of a multiplicity of pieces that work together. One of these pieces is the political organization that structures it, and it's made up of dioceses. A diocese is an area of territory over which a bishop is responsible. And in 1826, we have the creation of a new diocese in Montreal, and it's separated from the only one that existed up to then was based in Quebec City, so it's because it's become too big with too much population, it's separated into smaller pieces. And in 1840, we have a new bishop that comes to Montreal. He's young, he's only 40, and he is very enterprising, very ambitious. And his name is Ignace Bourget. Now, this is a later picture of him. He was Bishop of Montreal from 1840 to 1876. I had fun reading his correspondence. The man wrote enormously. And he also was involved in almost everything. He had his feet in every single possible corner of the diocese. He saw his role as a very, very active one. And at multiple levels. When he became bishop, he had a problem. The first problem he noticed was that the Catholics were rather lukewarm. They didn't really care. Now, if that rings a bell today. And he thought what was needed was to create some kind of enthusiasm, to revive the troops. And the way he did that was by inviting missionaries who, more or less like televangelists today, would gather people in fields, and these were Catholic, not Protestant, who were gathered large crowds in fields and preach them doom and gloom and invite them to convert. The Protestants were doing exactly the same thing, and Bourget said, well, if the Protestants have success, why shouldn't we try the same strategies? And so that was to try to revive popular religious feeling. And it succeeded to a certain extent. He scared out of some people. Now, of course, that's a good thing to get people started, to get them enthusiastic, to get them, for example, to renounce drink and avarice and well, other sins which I won't mention here. But the problem is to get that thing to last. And Catholics, if they're good at one thing, I should know, it's institutionalizing things, creating structures which carry on what in the Catholic Church we call the charism, the basic mission, or the inspiration behind something. And in the 19th century, there's this widespread movement, not only in Quebec but also in France mostly, of creating religious congregations. And religious congregations are associations of men or women, never the two of them together, which, in the case of women, they're called nuns. In the case of men, they're called priests and brothers, which have a specific mission and which take on various aspects of work to work for the church. And in Bourget's time, the main basic needs were for education. They were for social services. Montreal is becoming an industrial city at the time. There is a lot of poverty and quite a few problems arising from people moving from the countryside into the city and not necessarily having jobs. And so Bourget sees a real social need, and he answers it by creating these. Well, he first imports religious orders from France, and when he can't import them, he just creates them. And the way he does that is, for example, in 1843, there is a widow named, that's not in my notes, I'm sorry for the interpreters, named Émilie Gamelin, who creates an asylum for the aged, for the poor. When I mean asylum, I mean a place of refuge, really, for the poor, who come to it to, well, get help. And Bourget, looking at that, says, that could be an interesting congregation with an interesting social mission. And so they became the Sisters of Providence. And so he did that with a variety of initiatives, and other bishops were doing the same thing. And he's more or less trying to corner the market. He's trying to make sure that the church is present everywhere. And part of it is charity, part of it is he's really answering a real need, part of it is also political. Bourget is a very controversial figure in Quebec history. He's seen as a very conservative reactionary, and he became that later on, bishop, who fought state reform and these kinds of things. Actually, he was forced to resign in 1876 because he dabbled in politics. And in 1844, among all his projects, I mean, you can imagine this guy, I was going to say he's sitting in his office, that's probably the one thing he never did. He's having all of these ideas and intuitions, and, oh, we should do this, and we should do that, and all of a sudden in 1844, in one of the religious newspapers, we see, what about the deaf? And here comes the whole story of what had happened in the 1830s, and Bourget goes, well, if the state won't do anything about it, we will. Now, he was also facing a problem. He needed someone to do it. So why Montreal? Why did education move into Montreal? By mid-century, Montreal has become, I was going to say the Calgary, but then I'm in Edmonton, I shouldn't say that. It's become the sort of the economic hub of Quebec. And of what was called Canada East at the time, if I want to be technical. It is becoming much more important than Quebec City as far as economic activity is concerned. And it also becomes the center of new immigrants. It's very, very dynamic, very commercial. And Bourget somewhat benefits from that context where there's a whole bunch of mix coming up. And it's becoming a big city with the services that accrue a big city. I think calling Bourget an entrepreneurial bishop is almost an understatement. But certainly he was one of the reasons why this institution was created. At the same time, the Bishop of Quebec City is very, very much more concerned with his own personal piety, and he's sort of taking a backstage to this. He gets involved into controversies with Bourget because he doesn't like how enterprising Bourget is, but really he's jealous. And then a volunteer pops up. This man whom I mentioned, who as a priest has been moved to that college and possibly met Antoine Caron. His name is Irénée Lagorce. Well, once again, a little bit like the Abbé Lépée, we don't quite know exactly what happens, but what we have is a story that really resembles that of the Abbé Lépée. He met a couple of girls who came to ask for charity in his rectory. He was at the time assigned to a parish at the south of Montreal on the South Shore, and basically he said, shouldn't there be education for them? And walked up to Bourget, and Bourget said, oh sure, why don't you do it? So Lagorce instantly became the founder of a deaf school. Whatever qualification he might have had, he might have learned from Antoine Caron. That's about it. So what he did in these first years was basically, his purpose was to try to catechize these children, i.e. to teach them religion. So he showed them pious images and tried to explain them what it meant using some kind of home sign. After 2 years of this, Lagorce said, I need help. And so he went back to the bishop and said, well, you know, what could I do? And of course he had read the little literature that existed, but that was about it. Oops, I forgot to put those up. So in 1848, there was a deaf school. The official date of the founding of the deaf school is 1848. And that was the couple of years that Caron did his work, Lagorce did his work on the South Shore. Then in 1850, a rich doctor in Montreal, medical doctor, gave money to the bishop to say, well, you know, here, use that money to buy property and to build a school on it. He didn't say what kind of school. He said, build a school. And the bishop decided to use it for the deaf school. And this is the building that was erected. I mean, it's a rather imposing 3-story building. They built out of stone. And actually that building still exists somewhat hidden within the shell of another larger building that doesn't look like that at all today. And after that, well, while this building is being constructed, the school sort of closed, and Lagorce was sent to Europe to, well, learn how to teach the deaf. Now Lagorce sort of went around. Originally he had been sent to a congregation, another religious order, who did that kind of work in Europe, hoping that they would send Caron back with a few other brothers to help him. But when Lagorce got to Europe, I mean, you have to imagine here there's no telephones. Letters take about 6 months to cross the ocean, so the bishop's wishful thinking that that congregation would take on Lagos was not exactly a reality once Lagos actually set foot in France. He was not welcome, really. And so he ended up going around and touring the schools for the deaf that existed in France. He didn't go to the one in Paris, strangely enough. And he ended up in a school in Lyon, which is in the southern part of France. And near Lyon, there was a religious order called the Viatorians that had been created, and Lagos would go visit them over the weekends to rest. The founder of that religious order was still living at the time, and a little bit like Bourget, that founder had grand plans. Now, Lagos settled within the Viatorians, and he did what is called a novitiate, which is a training to become a member of a religious order. And while he was studying the methods of education for the deaf, and in 1852 he came back to Montreal and he had become a Viatorian, a member of that religious order. That order was already present in Canada, but they were not in Montreal directly, so this was the first time they'd come to Montreal as in the city. So he settled back in that school, which had been built in 1850, and 3 years later, that man, Brother Young, who was, despite his name, he's French, but he's from the German-speaking part of France, Alsace-Lorraine, and he was deaf. Had been working as a teacher in one of the deaf schools near Lyon, and was interested in religious life. And he also had come to meet the founder of the Viatorians because he was interested in religious life. And the founder just went, "Oh, we have a deaf school now. We could use you if you want to go to Canada." And Brother Young was all for it, and in 1855 he arrived in Montreal, after having undergone the proper training to become a brother. Now the story is a bit murky. The few years between 1852, when Lagos returned to Montreal, and 1855, the congregation, the religious order, did not quite know what to do with that deaf school. They were more or less in the way. And it was moved around until when Brother Young arrived, he was deaf. All of a sudden, there was no choice. Deaf education had to be done because there was a deaf brother. And he remained in Montreal until his death in 1898. So he was very much a reason why the congregation decided in the long term to take on the deaf education. Moreover, Lagos, the original priest who had founded it, was a particular character. I think he was probably manic depressive. He would tend to get very enthusiastic about something and then abandon. And in 1856, in a phase, well, if he were manic depressive anyway, in a phase of depression, he left the congregation, went into a more secluded order. He became a Trappist. And he died a few years later, no longer connected with the deaf community at all. But Brother Young was there. And he essentially took over the school until in 1863, another hearing brother, Alfred Bélanger, took over. And Bélanger, although he was hearing, was very much, he took the mission of educating the deaf very much to heart. And he's very much at the core of the development of this institution. All right, I know that's a lot of names and moving about, but what I sort of want you to retain here is that these first years they're trying things. They're attempting to do something for the deaf with a religious mission. The first objective here is to get the deaf to become to be good Catholics like their parents, for example. This is an entirely Catholic society, except for some very separate part of it, which was Protestant. There's no competition between churches here. Also, this movement to Montreal is not just a new location. It is that. But, and it brings it into this heartland of a city and heartland of possibilities for the deaf. But it's also a new mission, a mission that is centered on the church. From 1832 to 36, it was a state-sponsored mission. The idea was to create citizens. Well, religion was part of it, but as that general identity of all French Canadians. In 1836, it becomes really a church mission. And when the school is founded in 1848, it really is a religious mission also. But for some kind of educational institution to last, it has to fit within the social background. And here, the social background within which it fits is the French-Canadian Catholic social identity, if you want. The reason these deaf people were to be educated was so that they would become good Catholics, but becoming a good Catholic was also becoming a good Canadian. That was the idea. It was a dominant social value for that segment of Canadian society. And the way the state got involved in the church, in this system, starting in 1841 with the creation of these departments of education, essentially confirmed the church's mission because it sponsored it. So the church took that initiative, and then it was recuperated by the state and sponsored by it. And also, in 1841, what they created was a separate branch of education for the Catholics and another one for the Protestants, even in Quebec. And so there's a distinct system here that's based on confession. It's a confessional system that is put in place. And this would last until the 1990s. It was enshrined in the British North America Act in Article 93. Now, Catholic education is inherently sex segregated. Catholics have a problem with sex. I mean gender. There were rules, very, very strict rules, and there's a reason for that. And it's not just an obsession or a psychological problem at all. There were good reasons for not wanting men to educate adolescent girls. And the opposite. So, if there was a school led by a community of brothers, logically there needed to be a school for the girls led by a community of sisters. And that community, of which I mentioned the foundation in 1843 by Bishop Bourget, was put in charge of educating deaf girls. There's also a personal connection through this. The first person in charge of that institution, her religious name was Marie de Bon Secours, but her real name was Albine Gadebois. I'm sorry, you don't need to take those down. This nun had gone to the public instructions that Brother Young would give every Sunday, because he was not just teaching in the school, he would also go in parishes and teach the deaf in the parishes in Montreal. So she would come to his conferences, and she got interested in them, and eventually started teaching deaf girls in 1851. Now, her religious order was very, very different from the Viatorians. I didn't mention why the Viatorians were founded, but they were created in 1831 to teach. They were a teaching order, essentially. And now we have a congregation of nuns whose role was not to teach, but which was more a charitable role. They had been founded to take care of the poor, which take on also a religious, they had a lot of schools eventually, but it was not their first mission. And for them, the education of the deaf took on a different color. For the men, and it's also related to what we thought men at the time were supposed to do, they had to be educated to do a job and these kinds of things. So the men's school was very much about education. The women's school at the beginning was much more like an asylum. a place for the deaf to go and be protected from the bad influence of the world and become Catholic. And so there was a different tone, although they were both Catholic, there was a different tone to the education. And of course it tied into the fact that girls were not expected to grow up and have jobs at the time. They were expected to grow up and become good mothers and to instill these values that they would have learned in school in their children. And from the beginning, the Sisters of Providence tried to get the deaf to become sisters. It takes a while for this to happen. They first integrate a few of them, and then they create a separate deaf congregation. I wrote a book on that, so I'm not going to go more into them, but it was much more of a priority for the girls than for the boys. Also, these schools, they were both Catholic, but they were not attached. That's where, you can't imagine the Catholic Church as this big monolith, this big thing that works together all the time. It's various little pieces that end up working together, but that are somewhat independent from one another too. So there was the girls' school and the boys' school. They did occasionally consult with one another, but they became two very different universes. And one very visible characteristic for that, and it's lasting in Quebec deaf culture today, was that the sisters had a little bit of a problem with signs that were about here. So when they were about here, they tended to transform them. Now I don't have any examples to give you, but what happens is that there are girl signs and boy signs in Quebec Sign Language. They're slowly disappearing, but until the 1970s, there were clearly two variations on the sign language that had appeared. Now, the big question, so what? Coming to Montreal is important because of these institutions that are created and because there's a population base which allows for these institutions to last. But also Montreal is becoming, as I mentioned, the important city. Urbanization is moving into the city. It's becoming a commercial center. There's a variety of cultures coming in, but also a variety of confessions, religions. Well, religion, I mean various variations of Christianity. There are Catholics and Protestants of various colors. It changes what it is to be a citizen in a way. Because, well, it's a bit of a trite and it's a generalization, but previous to industrialization, to be deaf was less of a problem because you could still work on a farm. As I said, I'm making a big generalization here. But when you're moving into the city, it becomes more of a problem because you have to find a job. And you have to compete with hearing people. And this changed the role of the institutions, which gradually took on more and more of a vocational aspect, especially the boys' school, but even the girls' school. Very rapidly, they were training girls into needlework and fine lace work and stuff like that, to give them an edge. In many ways, deaf education was superior to hearing education. Signs in school were not a problem until they started thinking about the 1880s, but at the beginning it was not a problem at all. The objective was not to teach French or English. There were English and French classes in those Catholic schools. It was to teach them how to believe. And that could be communicated with signs as much as with spoken language. So there was no issue at the beginning with this signing. However, as they're trying to give them a competitive edge, as the educators are trying to give them a competitive edge, well, spoken language sort of becomes more important because it's just essential to communicate in shops, for example. It's one of the reasons why gradually it will enter the schools. Yet, contrary to the United States, I'll say that later on, but Catholic identity is not tied to language. There are English and French Catholics in those Catholic schools. and they're both taught the same language in many ways. It's easier to teach them science than to have English and French classes. These evolved later on. Third point. Now we have these embryonic institutions that are being born. Gradually they become bigger. Up there you have the first building of the Catholic girls' school, and I, engrave that in your mind because you'll see it changes. Down here you have the boys' school, which was enlarged in the 1880s. You have workshops here, and this wing, which was new, and they had added a floor to it. I didn't put the much more enlarged version of the building because it was only 1921, but you see these institutions becoming bigger, and the boys' school also had a farm between 1882 and 1896. And at the top we have a newbie, the Protestant school. Brings interest to the whole picture because Montreal is the only city in the world at the time to have 3 different schools defined essentially by religion. I think New York possibly had 3, but then they had oral schools. It was a bit different. So in 1856, we have the 2 Catholic schools are becoming well established. Actually, the building which I showed you for the girls' school was built in 1864. So they have a permanent building, they have a place in the city, they have benefactors who are tied to them. And so they're part of this social network. And they also get a state subsidy. It's not big, but it's regular. They're very involved with the public. They have these public demonstrations of the pupils because they want to show how deaf education is good, how it's useful to society. And it's partly these demonstrations which would bring spoken language in it because it's much more spectacular. It's almost magical. We get the deaf to speak. I developed that in my thesis. Protestant educational systems started being organized at the time as a reaction to the Catholics, because Protestants traditionally did not have the same kind of way of structuring their systems as did the Catholics. It was much more local. It was tied to the local churches, and in Britain actually the church was endowed. It was established, the Anglican Church, and so that their model was a state church essentially, which resembled what had existed in New France, but did not correspond to the reality of the 19th century. And so there was adaptation that needed to be done. And we have in deaf education in 1869 the appearance of a Protestant competitor to the 2 Catholic schools. And here's Thomas Witt. I love Thomas Witt. He's fun. He was quite a character. He came from England in 1868, and he came to work as actually an editor. He wrote articles, and he also printed in the Montreal Witness. The Witness was a very, very, very political religious paper for Protestants. It was basically, well, every second line was saying Catholics are bad. And Witt fit very much into that project. He's adamantly anti-Catholic. Actually, Witt is probably the only educator of which I know what he said, because 2 of his students' notebooks are still available at Mackay Institution. I actually read them. And boy, is it fun. He was telling them, well, everything that was wrong with Catholics and everything that was great with Britain. So this is a very, very ideological type of teacher. And understandably, because he had this zeal for Protestantism, he was deaf, came to Montreal. There's no school for the deaf. They have to go to Ontario or to the United States. He goes, well, we need one. And then, because the Montreal Witness was connected with a lot of rich Protestant Montrealers, they managed to get together a committee which created a school which opened its doors in 1870, but it was founded in 1869. Now, it was more of a private venture. It took a bit of time to get state support, partly because of wit. When you're too outspoken, you get into trouble sometimes. And it was only in 1878 when James Mackay endowed the school, i.e. gave it a large sum of money for it to last, and gave it a new building. I'll show you what building that is in 1878. That's when the school really took off. And like the Catholic schools, it became a permanent fixture, but it was located in the west side of Montreal. Montreal is split religiously and linguistically along a north-south line, so west is Anglo-Protestant, more or less, and east is French Catholic. Especially at the time, it's very rigid. Now the story, I will skip the story of his replacement in 1883, but he was replaced by a hearing woman. And it really represents how Mackay was shifting into a more American model, contrary to the Protestant, the Catholic schools. And here's the school that Mackay built. Now, that's quite something, isn't it? And that was built in 1878, and the building lasted until the 1960s. I forgot the exact date when it was demolished because it had become too old. Now, at the same time, here's what the nuns were building. This building still stands. And it became, in 1978, it became a government building. It houses a bunch of services, among other services for the deaf in Montreal. And within that building, there were nuns living, there were deaf nuns living, there were lay people who were renting rooms to help support the work of the nuns. There were hearing male children who came to a day school that was located at the back on the far left. So they were not connected with the deaf students at all, but their boarding, not their boarding, but their tuition helped pay for the school because many of the deaf students could not pay their tuition, and certainly not the full room and board. Of course, there were deaf girls of the oral and of the manual group. This large building had enabled the separation of the two groups. But they were still in the same school. So what we see happening is an informal type of schooling to a very, very institutionalized, very present in Montreal. It shows the importance of education in general in society. At about the same time, we see schools in general developing. Now you have to remember that education was not mandatory in Quebec until 1943. So these were very forward-looking, in a way, institutions. I think that per capita there were more deaf people who had a long education than there were hearing students at the time. The services that the institutions offered became much more varied with time. They were no longer just schools where students basically learned the 3 R's and learned how to become good Catholics. The schools offered vocational training. They offered support services for the deaf who, after they'd gone to school, were somehow in financial or other trouble. Often the educators of the deaf would continue working as interpreters for their former pupils until their death. They also developed oral courses starting in the 1880s. But never were they mandatory. In the 20th century, they became more the preferred course. But in the 19th century, we don't see oralism as rigidly enforced in Montreal as it is, say, in some schools in the United States. And partly it's due to the particular circumstance of Montreal. The church and Montreal society could not have afforded to build Catholic oral schools and Catholic manual schools, and then of course you'd have to have one for the girls and another one for the boys. And the Protestants were more or less in the same situation. There was not enough of a population base to exclude non-oralists. And so later on there was the Montreal School for Oral School for the Deaf that was created in 1950, so it's an entirely different reality. And by that time also the Catholic schools sort of changed. But we don't see the same pattern. There's no neat division that happens in 1880. Now my question is, did it really happen in 1880 in the United States? That's a different story. My reading of the American Annals of the Deaf between 1870 and 1920 does not allow me to see a neat division. So a few questions/conclusions. In the United States, and these are categories or characteristics that have often been borrowed to try to explain deaf education around the world. In the United States, the schools were state-sponsored. There were a few private schools, but if you read Edward Allan Fay's compendium of all the schools in North America, there are very few private schools. All of them are essentially funded by the states. It's not the case in Canada. It is the case in Ontario, not in Quebec. In the US, there is a movement of professionalization of deaf education. It becomes a specialty of education. In Quebec, the portrait is a bit different because there was a tendency for the nuns and the brothers in the Catholic schools who taught in the deaf schools to remain there and to make a career of it. But before being deaf educators, they were brothers and nuns. So they could be called upon to go back and teach in another school. They had to remain flexible. The idea of professionalization is a bit iffy. And there's a core group that tends to stay, but there's also a lot of them who come in on trial and stay for a couple of years and move on to other pursuits. Mackay follows more of the American model at that time. It becomes more of people who are trained to educate the deaf and who make a career of it. In the US, there's a feminization of teaching. And that goes hand in hand with oralism because it's thought that oralism does not require the same kind of, well, it's repetitive, it's just learning, you have to repeat the same words with the kids, and it's boring for men who like higher intellectual pursuits. And so the movement in the United States is that women become very important, and there's a lot of women who become principals of deaf schools, much more than normal schools, or sorry, ordinary schools. Normal schools are a different story. Once again, Mackay sort of represents the American system, but the Catholic schools can't. In the US, there are a variety of teaching approaches being used. I would say that carries on in Montreal very much, at least in the 19th century. They're trying a whole bunch of things, and they're discussing about them. Reading once again, the American Annals of the Deaf in the 1880s is fascinating. They're talking about a whole bunch of various things they try with students, and they go into great detail about them. One day I'll write an article on these things. And in the United States, one thing that's very important, and this is the argument that Douglas Bainton has developed, but he's not the only one, was that one of the pressures for oralism came from the major crisis that the United States had known, which was the American Civil War, which had split the country. It's going to be afterwards. So there was a movement to make English the language. This was the same thing that was happening in Italy and in France and in Germany at the time because they were becoming countries. That doesn't really apply in Montreal. Language is not that important. Religion is much more important than that. Oh, I had forgotten to put it up. Was that your hand? So, in Montreal we have 3 schools in one city, which all offer more or less the same kind of education, but they have very, very, very different types of target audience, if you want. Each of them has to deal with a different religious group. There's also a linguistic dimension. I mean, in Mackay is also all English. There is a clear separation by sex and religion. Even Mackay, it does accept both boys and girls, but there's a wall between the two. Within the schools, there are various levels of separation, and as oralism comes in, we see separate rooms for the oral kids and for the manual kids, but there's also a bit of flexibility. There's contact among them. They're not in different schools. And we see in Montreal the emergence of 2 main deaf groups. And later on we see the emergence of 2 main deaf languages. ASL and LSQ are both present in Montreal. It's a shame that I didn't learn ASL when I was there. Maybe I'll catch up. And so, conclusions? Are there conclusions? At least these are a few intuitions I want to run by you. And these are a few intuitions that could be interesting in the Alberta context, I think, possibly, as I go into my research here. One of the first things I noticed was how the importance of the local communities is important for the character that the schools take. And I have a feeling that when we talk about deaf education, it's a little bit like talking about the Catholic Church. It's this big thing which seems like a big unified reality, which really isn't. Now, I'm not the only one saying things like that, but it's a recent trend to try to look at local deaf communities and their roots. I think part of it was the 1970s and the desire for deaf rights. You had to be together. But now there's a desire to explore more local realities. At least that's what I see when I look at Montreal. You can't just blend it together with a North American reality, whatever that is. There certainly is a great diversity within Montreal, and one would say also that Montreal could be, I will use a worn-out phrase here, a distinct society. At least it's certainly different from the rest of Canada. I'm pretty sure of that from what I know of the rest of Canada. And unfortunately, Clifton Carbon, in his absolutely wonderful work, did not really do justice to the Montreal reality, because I think he didn't quite understand it. Partly because of language, he could not access all of the sources. It's a bit frustrating as a researcher, but at the same time it's exciting because I have work to do. For people who don't study the deaf but who are interested in the social characteristics of Quebec, deaf education is really interesting because it shows how Quebec society was not closed in on itself, a priest-ridden society, as some researcher had written in the 19th century. It's very much open to what's going on around it. There are influences coming from France, there are influences coming from the United States. There is contact between the Catholic schools and Mackay. So it's not as much as it could be, but there is. So we can't see here Quebec as a closed-in society. Moreover, the Quebec schools sent work to, for example, the Chicago International Exhibition in 1893 to be viewed by the world. So not only was Quebec open to things from outside, influences from outside, it wanted to showcase itself to the rest of the world. Or French Canada, I should say. It's not Quebec at the time. So are US interpretations entirely transferable? I think in part. And later, when you're talking about the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, yes, there are influences that are much closer and in line with French-Canadian nationalism, which became Quebec nationalism. We have the emergence of a certain kind of deaf nationalism, which is not unlike deaf pride in the United States, and borrows the same language. So, but in the 19th century, it doesn't work, at least not from what I see. Of course, I could not interview deaf people who lived in the institutions in the 19th century. Unfortunately, they have passed away. I can read their correspondence, though, and that's fine. So one question I'm asking myself is the situation of Montreal unique in Canada? Or were there also other idiosyncrasies that we could find in other places across the country, which would not necessarily create a Canadian model? I don't think there is such a thing. But at least avoid the danger of just borrowing explanations from the United States to try to understand our own reality. And that's important even in today's kind of political debates. If you've got your historical facts wrong, you can't make a good argument. Not in my eyes, anyway. But I'm a historian. And finally, one thing that I'm also wondering is it something that's particular to the 19th century? As I mentioned, in the 19th century, we have a very fluid situation. They're still trying things out. They're testing the waters. They're trying a state model, it doesn't work. They're trying this church model, it works, but it works in different ways. They're trying different types of models of education and seeing how this works. Later on, it becomes more institutionalized and more rigid. So, and I know that in the rest of Canada, because the societies developed later, well, there was the institutions that developed tended to borrow models that had been born in the 19th century. And maybe they're a bit more similar to the United States, but research needs to be done still. So these are my intuitions, my questions, and also a few of my findings for your own